Thanks very much for joining us today. Really delighted to have you, and it's our first IUA DigEd webinar of the new academic year. I'd like to thank Mairead O'Reilly very much for inviting some of her colleagues to join us today. I think it's going to be really interesting, and delighted as well to be joined by Jennifer and Alice and Oliver as well. So without me talking for very much longer, I will hand over to Mairead to introduce her colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We have a double bill from UCD, whom I'd like to thank for coming along and offering to share with us how they used online teaching to their advantage this year. Jennifer Keenahan from Civil Engineering will discuss how she used Zoom and a flipped classroom approach to engage students. And following any questions in the chat, Jennifer will be joined directly by Alice Clancy and Oliver Kinnane from Architecture to discuss how they use digital media to facilitate collaborative interdisciplinary work. So now I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Keenahan. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to meet with you all. I'm going to share a couple of slides now. I'm hoping you can see my screen. So as Mairead mentioned, I'm based in the School of Civil Engineering in UCD, and I'm going to talk today about the flipped classroom approach that I implemented in my teaching during the recent lockdown, and those activities that I used to engage students. So by way of a little bit of background, I teach 3 modules. They build on each other. So I teach the Engineering and Architecture of Structures 1 to first-year engineers and architects. The second module to second-year students, there's about 90 of them. Again, it's a mixture of engineers and architects. And then in third year, the Engineering and Architecture of Structures 3, I just have the architecture students for that module, and there's about 60 of them. And like I mentioned, they're in their third year. So these 3 modules very much build on one another. And the snapshot of things that I'm going to talk about today are drawn from the 3 different modules. So I'm kind of giving you an overview of different things. So just for those that might not be so familiar with the flipped classroom approach, the traditional classroom that we might think of might have the lecturer at the top beside the blackboard dictating or preaching or talking to the students. And really what I have moved towards is this flipped classroom idea where I give students some material ahead of time, and we work on activities during the classroom that support their learning. And then afterwards, there's some other activities for students to do. So right the way through my presentation today, you'll see this purple before icon, this green during and blue after. And I'll kind of signpost those pieces of before, during, and after. So there's a bunch of activities that I want to mention, things that I did with group work, an activity I did using Padlet, role play activities, rubric development, some peer review of previous student submissions, model making, and a table quiz. So I have a lot to cram into a short 15 minutes. So one of the key things that I used in our VLE, and I'm conscious that every university will have a different VLE, we have Brightspace here at UCD, and there's a really nice checklist function where you can provide a checklist for students of those items that they need to do in a given week. So depending on whether I have the students in first year or second year or third year, depending on what week we're in, I build out these checklists to be a little bit more thorough and a little bit more complicated. And there's one of these checklists for each week in the trimester. So I'm very much stepping students through what they need to be doing at all times. And invariably, this is the before feature of most of my activities. I give students a checklist of those things they need to do before they come to the classroom. So one of the activities I mentioned to you that I do is group work. Group work can be challenging at the best of times, and even more so when we're online. So one of the things that I did with my students was I got them to read an essay on hitchhikers. This is adapted from a paper by Oakley et al., where they provide this essay about what hitchhikers are, what couch potatoes are. Students are supposed to read this one-page essay and then submit a reflection. And I also get students to, I assign students into groups, and I create a discussion forum specifically for each group. Again, this is a function available to us in our Brightspace VLE, conscious that the VLE can be different in each institution. And that discussion forum is an available space for students to discuss their project work. I suggest to them to use that instead of a WhatsApp group, for example, because it also gives me some oversight about groups that are functioning well and those that aren't. And that has worked well for me in the past. I also get students to do an icebreaker activity. So this is the very first time that I put them into breakout rooms in their groups for the trimester. And I get them to introduce themselves to each other, explain what engineering is to the architecture students, what architecture is to the engineering students, and so on, and to discuss how they can work together. And students really have valued that opportunity, because in the online environment during the lockdown, it was perhaps some of the only engagement they got. So that's something that I get students to do during the class. And I also get them to create a team contract. This is something they prepare in breakout rooms. And it's designed to be this kind of quasi-legal document, so that students understand what they were supposed to be doing, that they agree to a kind of a student code that all students buy into. And they submit this as a formative assessment document through Brightspace. So I mentioned a little bit about a Padlet timeline activity. This is the next thing I want to mention. So for this activity, what I get students to do before they come to class is to read a set of notes on the evolution of structure and form. This is a key learning item in first year. So within their checklist that they see before class, they know they need to read this set of notes. And then the activity during class is that each student is in their group and is put into a breakout room through Zoom, and each group has access to a Padlet for that group. And what they're asked to do is to put the buildings, the photographs, in order on the timeline from earliest to most recent. So, you know, the beehive hut will be the earliest example of a structure, and something in the postmodern era would be the most recent. And this got students realizing, oh, I really should have read that set of notes. And those that did were better able to do the activity. So that's what we did during. And then afterwards, I presented students with an image of the correct timeline, with the relevant labels for the era of that building and the name of the building itself. I also mentioned that a little bit about role play and an activity that I do with students here. So this idea of role play allows students to explore the realistic situations they'll encounter in their future careers. So beforehand, I will have given students a set of reading, a set of notes on the historical relationship between engineers and architects, which discusses the roles of the engineer and the architect on projects, a little bit about the shared habitus and the stereotypes, and the importance of communication and teamwork. So before they come to class, students will have read this set of notes. And then during the class, I provide students with a role play, a description of the role that they're each going to play. In the first role play, the architects are the architects and the engineers are the engineers. And in the second role play, I get them to reverse. So the architecture students have to play the role of the engineer, and the engineering students must play the role of the architect. And in each case, there's a project description. A building is being built, the Gaiety Theatre is being renovated, and so on. So they read the role play description, and then in breakout rooms, they have to have this conversation. They have to thrash out the problems and the scenarios. And then afterwards, to reinforce the learning, I asked students using a Jamboard to post up some of the things that they found from that experience. What did they learn about how architects think, about how engineers operate? Were there any cliches in there? Were there any stereotypes? How was their experience? And the screenshot you see on screen there is a snapshot of what the students said, which is fascinating, really, when you see them coming out with that after just a very short interactive activity. The next thing I want to mention is about rubrics. So for one of the assessments in one of my modules, the rubric that I give students has 4 criteria. So this is a poster that I'm asking students to complete. And the marks for this poster are divided between the technical understanding students demonstrate, the presentation, layout and typography, the choice of photos they use, and the quality of the sketching in the images. So I provide students with these criteria for their rubric for the assessment beforehand. And I suggest to students that they might decide to weight the criteria like this. They might decide that the technical understanding should be worth 70% and everything else should be worth 10. Or I suggest to students they might like everything to be worth equal marks. Either way, I say to the students, these are the 4 criteria. It's up to you to decide the weighting. So during the activity in class, students are put into their breakout rooms and they discuss in their groups what the weighting they feel would be appropriate for each of these criteria. And of course, we're all in the online context. So how do we manage this? How do I capture this data? And what I got students to do was to populate a Google Sheet. So this video is students popping in what they think the weighting should be for each criteria, depending on which group that they're in. And ultimately, what I did then was I collected the average of each criteria. And I suggested maybe we'll use the average as the weighting. And some students said, oh, no, I don't like that. I think it should be more, this should be worth less, and so on. So we debated on what it should be. And eventually we came up with the final weighting, which you'll see here on this screen. And this is what I added into Brightspace afterwards. So students wanted 34% exactly for the technical understanding, 24% of marks for the sketches and images, 21% for presentation and layout, and 21% also for the photographs. So this is a relatively simple rubric for one of my first year modules, but I did this activity for all assessments in all my modules. So this is another screenshot, for example, of a more complex rubric that I used with the third year students. And these are the weightings that they decided on. So peer review is another activity that I engaged with my students during the lectures. And in UCD, we have access to a tool called Peer Scholar for peer review activities. So I populated this peer review tool with samples of work from previous years. And I embedded within this the rubric for this assessment. And students had time during class in their groups to review samples of assessments submitted by previous students in previous years. And this was fantastic because it really gave the students a feeling for what they needed to do, what was expected of them, and it clarified the assessment criteria for them. Model making was something, I'm very conscious that this is a whistle-stop tour through what I've done. I hope you are able to keep up. Model making was another activity that I did with my students. And this is where they must design and develop a scale model of one of the buildings that they're designing. So before they come to the class activity, they must prepare a drawing in a drawing package. Could be AutoCAD, it could be Rhino, it could be SketchUp. And they must prepare the drawing of the items that they're going to cut in 2D so that they can build their structure. And they must upload this drawing to a shared Google Drive folder. The various elements are then cut using the laser cutter. Each group was given a fixed amount of birch ply material. And then, even with all of the challenges of COVID, we were able to bring students together in person, socially distanced, to assemble their structures in UCD. And some of the photographs there you'll see on screen are of the models that students created. And we got a huge amount of positive feedback from this because it brought to life exactly what it is the students were working on. I mentioned that I did a table quiz, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. So this was a big undertaking, but students seemed to enjoy it. So in essence, I live streamed myself from YouTube, and in parallel had students in breakout rooms in Zoom. And the reason that I had to be on YouTube live streaming is that when the students were in the breakout rooms, they couldn't see or hear me. So they were watching me as quizmaster on YouTube, and I used a Google form to collect the answers from students, and at the same time had a live updated Google sheet with the results from each round. I will say I had a helper in the background grading the table quiz in each round, so that helped. So this was a bit of fun. Students enjoyed it. It kept them on top of their learning during the trimester, and it was an activity that was interactive, as opposed to me preaching to the audience the whole time. So at this point, I'm going to conclude and just to mention that if you are interested in learning any more about what I've done, I have a couple of articles that I've published, which you can see on screen, and I've posted some videos of my work on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. So feel free to reach out and get in touch at any point. If there's any questions, I guess I could take them at this point. I don't see anything in chat at the moment. Perhaps people might have some more questions at the end. But in that case, I will hand over to Alice now, who's going to deliver the second of today's talks. So over to you, Alice.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a million for that, Jennifer. It was fantastic, really inspiring. So my name is Alice Clancy, and I'm going to talk to you together with Jennifer and my colleague from architecture, Oliver Kinnane, about a collaborative teaching project that we ran this year. So, okay, I'm just going to check that you can all see my screen and that it's okay.
That's perfect, Alice. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So the collaborative teaching project that we ran this year comes out of kind of the three strands of our teaching and research, and I suppose all aimed at addressing the question, how can we better educate engineers and architects to meet the challenges of a changing world? And I suppose Jennifer really has led this with her colleagues in civil engineering, where they've been teaching groups of architects and engineers together in the engineering modules, and quite rightly, I suppose, pointing out the anomaly that professionals in the built environment work together on building projects, on design and construction, but are educated largely separately. And I suppose their work has started to address that. And in architecture, my work has been around developing architectural pedagogy, and particularly forms of feedback and review, and kind of developing the students' sort of critical purchase in their own work and the work of their peers. And then how we can translate or sort of apply that design thinking methodology online, and how we can create a design studio environment online. And then I suppose Jennifer and I wanted to collaborate on this with engineers and architects, and we invited Oliver Kinnane in, who very thankfully joined us, so to bring his own, so Oliver has a background in engineering and architecture, and his work on kind of applying, I suppose, a critical thinking to sustainable principles, and how you then apply this into the design process. So we're coming at it from these different points of view, and then trying to bring this together in the pairing for the first time this year of an engineering structural design module that's coordinated by Jennifer, and an architectural design studio module coordinated by myself. So they're both stage 2 modules, second year architecture and engineering students. And I suppose in pairing the modules this year, what we aim to do is to build on Jennifer and her colleagues' work, but to introduce the engineers to the methodology of the architectural design studio, and introduce the architecture students to the methodology, applying the architectural design studio methodology to problems and modules that wouldn't usually, they wouldn't usually be developing that in design studio. So the thinking there really is like architectural design studio methodology. It's actually quite an old and established methodology, almost kind of over 100 years old in architecture. But we think that there's methods to be gleaned by other disciplines in the methodology, in that it's, I suppose, over the course of their education, architecture students, pretty much half or more of their credits are taken up with architectural design studio, where they're presented with an increasingly complex series of briefs, an increasingly complex series of design problems that they have to develop or sort of address through this iterative process over the term, an iterative process of designing, so having an idea, then testing it through making, through drawing, and then presenting it at various stages to your peers and to external and kind of practitioner critics, external experts, getting feedback, discussing it, and then coming back and developing, revising and developing their design, then making more, presenting it again, and then revising it again. So it's this iterative process that builds to this, I suppose it becomes quite kind of a more acquired, slow and deep learning. And it's a kind of a critical process as well, where we think that this can really start to help us address this question of what do we need to do to develop our educational methods for engineers and architects and others in the built environment. So it's this open-ended process, and there's a lot of uncertainty in it, which I suppose brings the element of peer learning and how important that is in the design studio. And so I suppose the challenge then we were set with, so we Jennifer and I came up with this structure by which we could pair the modules and a kind of a series of events that would happen throughout the process of design that the engineering and architecture students would work on together in teams. And I suppose what we were trying to do was to use the architectural design studio methodology for the students to develop in mixed teams a design solution to the structural problem, and then apply that solution into the design project. So kind of trying to make in a very simplified way, a small part of how they might work in practice and how a design develops in practice. So the challenge then we were set with really this year, we knew late last year that it would be at least partly online. But then early in January this year, we came to the realization that actually this was going to be all online, and we were going to be very limited in what we could do in terms of materials with students. But then also a lot of our students were working from abroad, from different corners of the world, and wouldn't be working from Ireland. So we were kind of faced with this challenge of, well, how do we produce this, really rich peer learning environment for this experimental teaching project? How do we do this online? And so really what I wanted to introduce you to was this digital whiteboard Miro, which we used with Zoom to try to, in a small way, replicate studio. So this is a screen recording of an episode in the teaching project that Jennifer is going to talk about a little bit later, which was where we had groups. So basically we set up the project that the students were going to work, engineering and architecture students were working in 16 teams, each working on developing the design, the structural and material design of one of the architecture students' projects over the last 5 weeks of our 12-week term. So the way Miro works, Miro is a digital whiteboard that we used in parallel with Zoom. And Miro is essentially a space that a digital space, like a web page, that you can post images, text, drawing, video, links, any sort of information, you can post it there, and it's scalable and zoomable. So you can treat it like almost like a physical space, in that you can have kind of a hierarchy of information. You can organize the information that's posted up there, but it also works as an active drawing and development space. So it's kind of, it seems to work on a couple of different levels, and a couple of different magnifications, that where you can actually have groups of up to, I've used it with groups of up to, I think, 250 students working away in the same space, posting the same information, and the information then stays there afterwards and they can come back to it. So there's a possibility of, I suppose, synchronous and asynchronous work going on there. So this is what is fantastic about it is that you can set up, you can organize the web page so that you can have a kind of the hierarchy of information. So this is, you know, our modules, or the briefs and kind of technical information, the groups, the students, and then there's the last 5 weeks of terms. This is kind of each of the groups has a board for posting their work. And then each of the groups is very clearly numbered. So when I come into this web page as a student or as a guest reviewer, I can clearly see, okay, there's groups of different people working away in different places. And then when I zoom in, I can start to get on, and we would have put a Zoom link for each of these. And the students have just gotten, the groups of engineering and architecture students have just gotten their design project that they've taken on from another architecture student. They're discussing it, and they're trying to figure out how to start developing the structure. So they're online on Zoom, and you can see their little, the cursors each has their name on it, so you can see kind of who's working away on what. And they're at this moment just starting to get to grips with the design that they've been given to develop. And they're starting to research, you know, structural ideas, and then they're going to talk to an external expert, and Jen is going to tell you about this later, to try to develop it. And they're sketching over the drawings and the information that have been posted, and they're making notes and they're pinning them there for their peers. And so this is a screen recording where I'm just panning through each of the groups in process while each of these tutorials and discussions are going on. So Miro really, I suppose, because we could adapt it really to our own ends, became the kind of the home for this project, and it became a really, really useful home for the project. It's also, what was fantastic about it is that it's also very accessible, in that you can access it on your phone, you can access it through a mobile hotspot, or you can access it in a web browser and on the app. So it's like for all levels, and for students, say, working, you know, from home, they don't have maybe a very powerful laptop, or somebody else has borrowed the laptop in the home, they could actually get on it at least on their phone. And similarly, then students who are working in different time zones could join at various times and see what had happened if they weren't able to join the session during the day. So there was this, it became the kind of like the home for the project and the way it was developed, but then also it was the reviewing space and the workspace for the project. So I'm going to just click on out of this. Sorry, I'll just go back into this and just go on to the next. So I'm just going to tell you about one of the first instances where the engineering students were introduced. This was in week 6, just before they came into their teams to develop the design project, where they were introduced to the design project through this architectural design studio review known as the Roundtable Review, which is derived from, I've been doing work with TUD on their Rethinking the Crit project, where we're trying to, usually architectural reviews, the work is discussed, the student gets feedback, and then they go off and they try to develop their design. In Roundtable Review, it's an active feedback process where the reviewers, who are usually practicing architects, are discussing the work with the students, but the student peers are also discussing the work, and they're all drawing over the work. So it's a constructive review, and the engineering students were invited into this. So this was set up online on Miro and Zoom. Again, with Miro, I was able to give the day or the afternoon a visual structure. So when the students logged into the web page, they were presented with this, which had all of the information in the middle, and then each of the review tables all around the edges. So each of these were groups of 4 or 5 students with 2 reviewers and 2 engineering students joining them to discuss their work in progress and to get feedback on their work in progress. So it was all done via Zoom. And what was, I suppose, what we found amazing about that is that we were able to get reviewers from all over the world. And usually we're not able to do that, due to kind of logistics, time and money. But we had students working in these teams from all over the world, and engineering and architecture students, but we were also then able to get reviewers from all over the world to join us for this afternoon review. And there's something about the way we were able to use the digital interface to do that I think has really expanded the space of the studio for us. And I think certainly that we'll take into this project as it develops next year. So we used then this methodology of kind of small, like everybody working in the same digital space. So we were all on the same Zoom call, we were all on the same Miro board, but then each working in the Zoom call in breakout rooms, which were numbered based on the tables, but we were each working kind of in parallel and then coming back together at certain times in the afternoon. So it was this real kind of, I suppose, we were able to build up this kind of sense of a community of learning over the course of the afternoon. And we then applied that methodology to later episodes in the project. So I'm going to just move you on to, I'm just conscious of time and of going over it. I'm going to bring you back to Oliver, who's going to tell you about the next episode in the teaching project, which was a sustainability workshop that he ran over 2 different weeks with the students. So the students are working in their teams, they're engineers and architects. They've taken on this other architecture students project, and they have to develop it in structural and material detail. But we've asked them to develop it and to provide a sustainable solution to structure for the project and to the detailing. So this is where Oliver and his workshop came in. So I'm going to pass you over to Oliver. Oliver, you're going to share your slides?
Yeah, we'll do, yeah. Alice, as soon as you, yeah.
There we go.
Okay, hi everyone. So yeah, as Alice said, I was very much parachuted in to kind of give this this workshop on sustainability that initially was a single workshop, and then about an hour before the workshop I realized that I had far too much information to deliver in one workshop, so belatedly requested to Alice and Jen that I'd give it in 2 parts. So both workshops were focused on the embodied carbon, or the amount of carbon that's within these buildings that the students are designing. And the first workshop, I guess, focused on the building structure, and the second on the building skin, which might be seen in a way as being very specific to the engineer and to the architect. But I suppose what I wanted to do, or in keeping with the theme that Alice has already kind of defined, is kind of introduce the students also to the complexity of building and the complexity of sustainable thinking, I guess, in a way. And that, a building isn't just a single standalone thing, that it's a system of interrelationships. One design decision at an aesthetic level makes it, can have a big impact on the design decision at a structural level, or the structure can affect the architecture quite considerably. And also try and point out to the students how we can't really investigate sustainable design without looking at both the engineering and the architecture of the building. And hence that they had to collaborate, or it was essential that they collaborated together if we're really going to define a sustainable building. And I guess, it tried to introduce them to different ways of knowing, and through, I suppose, the idea that there were ultimately no panaceas or no singular design that would be the low energy option. And I mean, that might come as a surprise and maybe a disappointment to some of the students, but I also think it's important that they have a realistic idea of what they're attaining, and also that the design, as I say, the decisions that are made have impacts that maybe they're not always totally visible in the first place when the decision is being made, and hence that they need adaptability in achieving this sustainable goal. So the workshop was kind of, I suppose it was a workshop and a lecture, but through Zoom and through the chat room that was very ably coordinated by Alice, we kind of tried to create this kind of dynamic Q&A session where there was lots of content delivery in quite a short space of time on a topic that they're not particularly well versed in embodied carbon and general operational efficiency, or construction and operational efficiency of buildings. introduce them to a lot of sources, so where they can get this information, reliable information that they can rely on when they go back to do these exercises again for their own buildings and their own designs. And I suppose we looked at the whole building carbon analysis and the complexities and challenges of that, and therefore try to reduce it down to singular elements. So again, the structure and the skin via the beams and the envelope. And we looked at these sustainable alternatives, tried to find, was there a panacea there, and kind of talked about the resources that go into all kind of systems and all kind of design and material choices that are made within a building. And we looked at the full life cycle of the building, so that it's not just the building coming off the drawing table or coming out of the computer and job is done, but rather that the building lives a life, and the design decisions that are made early have impacts throughout the lifetime of that building. And the building also reaches an end of life, likely at some point. And can those materials be recycled? Can the building be brought back into a circular cycle? Or is it just lost? Will it always ultimately be unsustainable or of high impact? And we based this workshop kind of around 4 exercises, or as I say, the 2-part workshop around four exercises. And again, I think what I was really trying to do here is try to tie it to hard numbers, to quantification, and allow the students to start quantifying the impact of their architecture or their engineering decisions. And I guess that's kind of, having been in the field for a long time and knowing the kind of ideas and education that the students receive, it's often very vague kind of statements like timber is better than concrete, or hemp is better than insulation. Just because one seems more sustainable than the other. But as I say, it's a very, very complex kind of field, and I wanted to introduce the students to that kind of complexity without scaring them off from the topic. So we looked very much at benchmark figures initially, that 450 kilograms of CO2 go into every meter squared of built floor area. And if we're like in the next 40 years, we're expected to double our built floor area around the globe. And trying to relate that to, say, our carbon budgets as to how much that will be relative to the amount of carbon budget that we have for a 50% chance of avoiding a 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures. And that's about 20%. So it's a really big number. And it's important, I think, for these students to understand the significance of the design decisions that they're making, but also to try and relate them to how to numbers that the students might kind of understand more readily with how they live their lives, or the things that they buy. So what is 450 kilograms of CO2 relative to, say, the area that they're sitting in or occupying, or the floor area that they occupy every day, or the transportation, how they got to where they are, and the emissions that were released in doing that, or the phone that they're probably holding in their hand while they're half listening to what I'm saying, maybe, or maybe not, hopefully. So that was kind of led us to the first exercise then, which was to take a building that they had designed or were involved in, or a building that they're occupying, and use those benchmark figures to kind of calculate the carbon that's within that building. And then following that, we kind of led to a more detailed kind of analysis where we took a real building and asked them to look at this, using different structural systems. So in the first place, metal, steel, structure systems, timber and concrete, and try and define the embodied carbon of each to try and inform what might be a sustainable choice into the future. So here we are in the workshop during COVID times, representative of my own homemade COVID haircut that I was mortified to see on screen when Alice sent me on that screenshot. And so, that led us to this kind of, the students went off and calculated these numbers themselves, came back, and we talked about the answers, and all the staff involved did it as well. And we had some discrepancies, but we kind of broke it out, and I wrote up a solution for the students that we looked at then in the next class, the next day, to kind of talk about which was the more sustainable option. But then again, to come back to the idea or the concept of complexity in this team, in this theme, we looked at kind of that this isn't actually the full story. There's more going on here. When we talk about a piece of timber, it's just not the embodied carbon within it that's defined by its processing and its manufacture into a building material, but also it lives a life prior to that, where it's a tree that sequesters carbon. Maybe it's part of a sustainable forestry system, maybe not. What's the biodiversity impact if it's not? In the case of steel, how much of that steel is recycled? How much of that can reduce the embodied carbon? In the case of concrete, how much cement can we replace with something else? How much of the aggregate might be replaced with recycled elements? All of this, just kind of adding to the just informing more, or giving the students more information, I guess, about the general field of sustainability and the ideas that they had to kind of consider. And then that led on to the primary element of the secondary workshop, which was to focus more on the building envelope and the design decisions that were made at the building skin level. And the difference, say, in this image between the rammed earth versus the glass and aluminium kind of adjacent element, or the difference between the traditional and simple wall buildup with the contemporary kind of multi-layered wall buildup. And to try and get students and expand the conversation in this case to not only just the embodied carbon or the carbon that goes into the construction of the building, but also the carbon that's going to be emitted due to the operation of the building. So we might choose a low embodied carbon material to make the building, but then will it help retain the energy within the building or the heat within the building through its lifetime? And how does that balance out, or which outweighs which? So we looked at choices, say in this case, I'm showing pretty complicated images here, but in this case, looking at choices of different installation materials within a wall buildup for a best practice U value, which essentially defines the amount of energy that's retained within the building. And also then the thickness of the material, and whether that's from a design or structural perspective, whether that's actually viable and realistic. And again, very complicated kind of imagery, but again, looking at different wall types, and then over a longer time period, 25 to 200 years in these two examples, which might be the more efficient from both an operational and a construction perspective, reduced down to a meter squared of envelope wall. So they were the two workshops, as I say, covered quite a lot of information, both from a content and knowledge delivery perspective, but also, it was quite one of the first times the students would really have tackled the numbers and the scale of the numbers involved. So trying to make them au fait with that as well. So quite a complicated workshop, I think, delivered quite well through digital media, I hope, over the two lectures, where we got quite a lot of engagement through the chat room space. We got quite a lot of high energy dynamic engagement from the students. So we were quite happy with how it turned out in the end. That's me.
Thanks, Oliver. Just going to pass you back to Jennifer, who's going to tell us about the third episode from the teaching project. And I suppose it's just this episode then applies and builds on Oliver's workshop.
So I guess coming back to the kind of format that I used about the before and the during and the after, one of the activities that we engaged students with in this kind of combined project was to bring guest experts in to give students feedback on their work. So students at this point, we're kind of at week 8 out of 12 weeks in the trimester. Students have been working in their groups for a good number of weeks, and they've been preparing a design for their project. So before they came to this guest expert review, students were told that they needed to prepare a draft scheme design. So they had to come to the class with preparation work done, and they had to prepare some questions for the experts, so that they weren't just coming in cold, that they knew exactly what they wanted to ask the experts about their design. So jump on to the next slide there, if you wouldn't mind, Alice. So it was quite phenomenal what we pulled. I'm thinking back on what we managed to do last April. It was quite amazing. We brought together, I think it was 9 professional practicing architects and engineers. who would be considered experts in their fields. So those headshots that you see on screen there were those guests that we invited to join us. And in essence, we operated a little timetable that you can see on screen there. We briefly introduced the afternoon to everybody. And the groups of students had the opportunity to have 4 consultations. So they would meet 4 out of these 9 experts over the course of the afternoon. And they'd have a break for a couple of minutes in between each one. And at the end, then we'd all join the main room of Zoom again to close out. But the feedback from students and the feedback indeed from the experts was phenomenal. It was so positive, so encouraging. They really enjoyed it. And it was just amazing how much everybody got out of it. And we were all online. And it really had us realize, wow, you know, if we can get back to doing all of this in person again next year, it would just be magnificent. So this is what happened during the session. Is the students came with their designs, they showed them to the expert, they got feedback. The experts were magnificent. The engineers largely focused their feedback on the scheme design, the structural side of things, whereas the architects focused on how the design responded to the brief. So it was great that students got that mixed feedback. And of course, we tried to set everything up that students would get to experience a mix of engineers and architects, and no group ended up visiting just architects or just engineers. And then afterwards, if you could pop on to the next slide, thanks, Alice. Afterwards, what we encouraged students to do was to write down everything that they learned, to make notes. What did the experts say? What are you going to change about your design? What are you going to keep the same? What did you learn? Was it a useful experience? What are you going to do next? And this all got woven in then to the kind of reflective practice piece that we encouraged students to do. And in all, it was such a positive experience. I think we were buzzing for quite a while afterwards, which was great. So that probably brings to a close what we wanted to present on today. But I can keep talking here, Alice, or if you'd like to jump in, you can. We had quite a number of people to thank.
Definitely. I'm just going to put a link to the Miro board that I used, that you can just click on it and you can go in and have a look. So I used a Miro board to present this, and the Miro board I used was actually just the kind of summary board from the whole from the term from the architecture studio, and then I've just picked out the parts that just highlighted some parts for this. So you can go in there and have a look at it. It's just because I'm on Zoom at the same time, it's going to be a little clunky to load, but you can just have a look at kind of the interface, because I suppose the success of really that engineering and architecture consultation, you know, the way we were all able to occupy that same digital space together, I think really it really helped and allowed kind of the experts to post information there and kind of draw over the students' projects, and the students to also come back and kind of have a look at what was said, and also what was, you know, what was said or suggested to other groups. Okay, so I think we can finish up and maybe take questions. I can stop screen sharing now as well.
Thanks very much, everybody, for a really, really interesting presentation. I can see a couple of comments in the chat. It's just really interesting to see what you have done. I have one question, if you don't mind me asking about it. I can see how you have created such a fantastic collaborative learning experience for your students. So I'm just wondering about the assessment of the modules. I know it's kind of a mundane question, but was it completely continuous assessment, or did you have any sort of final examination for the modules as well?
That's a really good question. So it was something that we were very careful about all along, because there was 2 modules involved, and we wanted to be very clear with students that there was an assessment strategy in my module, and there was an entirely separate assessment strategy for Alice's module. In my case, it was entirely project work. I didn't have an exam as such. I don't think, I thought quite long and hard about this, and I don't think an exam for the learning that I want students to do, I don't think an exam is an appropriate assessment activity. So students, for me, completed a physical model, which you would have seen, and they also had a choice between whether to submit their work as a poster, as a short report, or as a video. Interestingly, everybody submitted a short report. Nobody was particularly interested in doing the video or the poster, but they had that choice. And then the assessment strategy for Alice's module was entirely separately its own thing. And for mine, it was group assessed, so students were assessed as they're in their groups, but it's all individual assessment for Alice. And perhaps you might want to say more there, Alice.
So Design Studio is assessed by a portfolio at the end of term, but all of the activities that we do during the term all build to form that portfolio. But then I suppose I put an additional layer on it this term. Like the students make a sort of an introduction to that portfolio, and then because it's digital, I asked them to make this portfolio book. So it's this kind of visual introduction to their portfolio, but it's also got reflective writing. So we worked with the UCD Writing Centre on that, so that the students like posted elements of their work from each week and then reflected critically on it and talked about how they developed their work and how, say, the teamwork aspects of the teamwork developed their thinking, and then how they revised things. So we were able to track the students' kind of the development of their work and their individual kind of thinking and design practice development over the course of the term. And then there was particular aspects of the project that were so like the model that Jennifer is mentioning is related to the engineering module, but then obviously the results of that kind of inform the design development in the architecture module, but it was separate, like it was in the structural engineering module, and then there was aspects like structural drawings and things like that that were part of the requirements for the architecture module. So we were very careful to make sure that each of the tasks, was separate while they were kind of informing and building on the same project. There was very clear elements for both modules that the students had to complete.
There's a question in chat there about students having difficulty getting to grips with Miro. Personally, I find that they're all brilliant with the technology. I mean, I think about, I'm going to sound very old now when I say this, but the first time I saw a computer, I was about 7 or 8. It was in school. There was one computer and it was for the entire school to learn how to type. I mean, my little 2-year-old son now can find Netflix on my phone, navigate to Peppa Pig and turn it on, and he's only just turned 2. So they all seem to be like digital natives, It doesn't seem to be any bother to them to pick up
no.
tools.
Like where we noticed kind of issues was more in kind of how the effect that had then on their work. So say, for example, like they're quite young, say architecture students, like they're second years, and Miro is scaleless. So usually a digital program that you're working in architecture, like drawing, there's a scale. So there's always a kind of a relatable, you're able to understand the proportion of things to each other. So there was sometimes things like that, Marion, where, we had to do a little bit of extra work with them so that they understood the ramifications of what they were doing or proposing. There was one area where there would be difficulties. So Miro is free. There's an educational license you can get, and it's free for the students to use. But I did find, like, when we were building, so when there was like 80 students or 100 students, say, working on one board, and if they were all posting information at the same time, and if we were, say, running a workshop over the course of an afternoon, by the end of that afternoon, the students who had slow broadband connections or were working from personal hotspots, they would find, the page would be slow to load. So there's an issue there, I think, in how the information kind of gets uploaded and downloaded. But one thing we did notice about Miro was that over the course of the year when we were all working online, because lots of design schools actually ended up using it, was that it got better. It was getting better as and it was developing as we went over the year. So it was very different when we were using it last year in the spring term in 2020 to this year. Like there was huge developments in it. So yeah, what I found the students were kind of faster at it than I was, provided their internet connections were okay.
That's always the problem, isn't it? Staying one step ahead.
Actually, I have one more question, if that's okay, and we'll finish up then, because I'm aware that we're coming up to 1:30. But my question is around, you were sort of forced into a situation where you had to do everything online last year, obviously, and yet it has worked, from what I can see, very, very well for you and your students. What do you intend to do this year?
That's a really good question, because myself and Alice have started talking about this kind of collaborative project for a while now. And when we finally got around to implementing it, we were in this online context. So we designed it for the online context. And now, ahead of next January, we'll be trying to think about, oh, okay, we're going to be in person. How do we adapt? How do we expand? How do we edit this? So hopefully things will only improve between now and then. And that we can draw on what we're having success with in this trimester and build on that for next trimester. Ideally, we'd be able to get them all in the one physical space. That would be most ideal.
I think that there's aspects to what we've done that I think were really enhanced by the use of the digital. I think particularly that ability to get and to engage with international experts. And I think that is fantastic. And I think that that's something that we'll keep. I think also the ability to kind of have the work in one place. And I think maybe having a parallel sort of Miro board and kind of maybe Zoom check-ins and things like that, because it is very unwieldy managing a big group of like 80 of these students, like working in groups in one space. But Jennifer is an expert at doing this. She's brilliant at it. But I imagine that we'll probably have some sort of digital support or kind of backup so that there can be that asynchronous aspect to it.
Plus, I don't know how we're going to get 9 experts in the classroom at the same time when they have to physically travel to the campus. So we'll have to think about that, whether there's an opportunity to have a digital piece there. Maybe that piece should stay online. Who knows? We'll just have to come back and talk to you again, Sharon, next September and tell you what we did.
I think definitely we'll have to have you back for sure. Okay, Mairead, did you want to say anything at the end? Finish up?
Just thanks very much. It was absolutely fascinating. Great to see in the flesh what is going on. I usually only hear the problems. Thanks to you all for presenting. It was really great. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm just going to stop the recording now.